Great. Hello, everyone. Very good evening or good day, depending on where you all are. My name is Urvashi Aneja, and I am the founder and director of Digital Futures Lab. We are a research organization, and we look at the interaction between technology and society in India and other parts of the global south. And our work is directed towards finding pathways towards more equitable, towards more sustainable, and just digital futures. So for the past year, we've been working on a project looking at the intersection of AI and climate action in Asia. Digital transformations as well as climate impacts are two of the largest forces or critical driving forces shaping the Asian continent. And the intersection between the two is still it's a very underexplored space currently. On one hand, AI can contribute to new efficiency gains, help us with climate forecasting, and multiple other ways in which we can accelerate climate action. At the same time, the use of AI also poses risks for climate action in terms of the environmental footprint of these AI technologies and so on and so forth. We've been looking at this across 9 Asian countries and across 3 sectors around agriculture, around power and energy transitions, as well as disaster response. And in the next month or so, we'll be releasing our reports on this topic. We have a series of publications that are coming out, a landscape report, 4 briefs, as well as 2 action briefs, and a number of country briefs from the countries we've been looking at. And for this project, we'd also assembled an expert network from the region. So really trying to understand what is happening at a local level and contextualize some of the global conversations around AI as well as AI and climate action. So as part of this project, one of the issues that has come up, or one of the topics that has come up in our research, is the concept of digital public infrastructure and digital public goods. There is a lot of momentum and enthusiasm around these currently in India as well as in other parts of the globe. We see the latest UN Secretary General's report, for an example, outlines a key emphasizes the importance of building digital public goods and digital public infrastructure. And similarly, under India's G20 presidency, there was a very, very strong focus on digital public infrastructure and how the Indian lesson could both be exported as well as provide learnings for other countries. And so one of the spaces that there is a growing, but it's a nascent conversation, is to what extent digital public goods and digital public infrastructure can be leveraged for climate action in the region. What are the opportunities? What are the risks? What are some of the challenges as we seek to leverage some of these new technological infrastructures for addressing climate action? So I'm really, really delighted to have a fantastic group of speakers to have this conversation with us. And I'm also really delighted to see how much interest there's been amongst the broader community who working on these issues on this subject. So thank you all to all the speakers for joining us, and thank you to all the participants and the audience for also taking time out for this conversation. So I'm going to hand over now to Gauravh Sharma, who's going to be moderating the discussion, as well as, of course, introducing the panelists. Gauravh is an advisor on AI to the German Development Corporation and holds 17 years of experience across 4 sectors, across IT, foreign and security policy, WASH, and development cooperation. He was also a tech policy fellow on AI at the Academy of International Affairs in 2022 and 23, and a task force member of the T20 initiative of the G20 from 2016 to 2020. He was also a member of, or is a member of, the expert group that we have put together for this project, and so is Aaditeshwar, who Gauravh will also introduce shortly. So Gauravh, over to you. To kick off this discussion, just one quick housekeeping rule. We are recording this discussion, so please keep that in mind. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please post them in the chat. Feel free to post them as the conversation is ongoing. We will be collecting the questions, collating the questions, and passing them on to Gauravh, who will then ask them of the respective speakers. So thank you all very much again, and really looking forward to this conversation. Gauravh, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Urvashi. Thank you for the invitation. And yeah, it's a relevant topic, also very pertinent to the sector itself, climate change. And climate action is something which practically impacts mostly the vulnerable communities, standpoint in the developing or the lower and middle income countries. So I think it's very important how the unpacking of this role of DPI when it is linked to climate action takes shape. And in this context, I think it is very relevant to just deep down and ask a wonderful set of speakers. I would start not in an alphabetical order, but the way I see it on my homemade document. So I'll start with you, Divya Sharma. She's an executive director at the Climate Group. And in this capacity, she leads a team of professionals who work with businesses and governments around critical systems on climate action. So also ranging industries. So it's very good, across sectors, transport, energy, and she's herself an international climate and urban development experts. So it showcases, her own sort of professional and personal examples. So the question that I'm marking to you, Divya, what are some of the key pressing and resource sort of issues or challenges on climate action in the region? And you can actually take your own experience in Asia. And where do you see these challenging challenges being addressed? We're already coming to the more than halfway mark of the 2030 SDG goals. So, I think your opening remarks will set the tone. Over to you, Divya. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaurav, and thank you, Urvashi, for having me here. And I think, yes, I was thinking when you were posing the question for me that it would definitely set the context. And I made some notes to put things in perspective. So, as you said, I will try to give some examples. Many years back, I was speaking at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, where I was the only speaker that was working on and speaking on the policy interface to climate action. And the rest of the speakers were very high profile international scientists that were working on the science of climate change. And what I saw today was actually mind opening for me as a young scientist or a researcher at that time to look at how developed our scientific research was around climate impact. And it was like 15 years back that I am speaking about. I had got a very small 5-minute slot to speak about policy interface during lunchtime. So it was not even the main panel where I could speak. And I understood at that time how some of these conversations think or not think about policy to implement climate action on ground. And that is the time from which I have actually started working on public policy, policy around climate. How can climate diplomacy lead to proper policy making in the regional context? And that has been the last 15 years for me, so to say. And in my own journey, I have started from working around adaptation to coming to climate group and working around mitigation and looking at how governments can shape mitigation and speed up climate action, but how businesses can shape um, climate action and how they are imperative to scaling up climate action and how they have the power and influence um, to speed up and accelerate climate action. So that is the I mean where I'm coming from, so to say. Um, what I also see after 15 years hence is that we are talking a lot about two main pillars to climate action, not only in the region but globally. One is technology, and for our side of world, technology transfer, and other is climate finance. I would leave climate finance for some time else, but on climate technology, I still feel that the questions of technology and influencing policies is still not very mature in a region like India, even South Asia. Why I say this is that it is still part of the climate diplomacy conversations that are very much international in nature at the moment. And some of these things have not trickled down enough to influence subnational level policies and local policies, let alone community level action. So while we know, for example, we are talking about DPI, we know that the area of influence of some of these digital public goods and infrastructure can be very, very community led, can influence a lot of emergency response, for example. And there are sectors that we can reap a lot of benefit if we could prepare that policy ecosystem around it, but it is not happening. I then studied a little bit because I'm not an expert on DPI. Urvashi knows. And I studied and, did some research, a little bit of it. And I found that DPI has a variety of um, influence to make when we talk about climate action. So, for example, we can use it in green financing, and I never knew it could be done. We could use in carbon market trading. We could use it in smart energy grid management of public transport and service efficiency, climate refugees, verification, identification, and data, and also distribution of public goods, whether it is during emergency or non-emergency scenario. And of course, early warning and weather systems, something that comes to everybody's mind when we are talking about anything digital. So when there is so much influence that DPI can make in the efficiency of adaptation measures as well as mitigation measures, why don't we have a policy ecosystem that can have the penetration of some of these systems into our working? For example, I've been an urban planner, and a lot of my work is around urban climate resilience. And we've literally struggled to bring in some of more technological, let alone DPI, interventions into urban planning mechanism or urban management mechanism. Like urban planning might be difficult, and it's not difficult, I'll come to that. But urban management itself is an easy thing to do, but we have not been able to do it even after the smart cities flagship scheme that we have in India. So,
Divya,
what are those
I would sort of
problems?
restrict it. Forgot to say that maybe keep your interventions for 3 minutes for now
Okay.
to begin with.
Do
But
I
thank you.
have do I
Yeah,
have 1 minute to make my
yeah,
final
you
point?
can conclude. Yeah, sorry for my
Thank
apologies.
you.
Yeah.
Just coming to my example on urban planning, I then looked at, is there any policy framework in India around geospatial? Because this is something that comes to my architect urban planning mind when we talk about where do we start with. And I actually found that there is a national geospatial policy 2022. Um, and there are several geospatial data acquisition, production, and dissemination rules that actually create an ecosystem before us, but we are not using it fully for our urban planning practices, which is directly related to how climate action can benefit, buildings can benefit, adaptation and mitigations can benefit when we talk about climate action. So I'll stop here and maybe see if there are any questions later on during the session and let others speak also. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Divya. I think the context setting on DPI's use in terms of climate action is already being talked about through the technology lens. Energy efficiency is one of the pertinent areas where it has been thought through and being used. And I take your pillars on the two pillars on actually also on the climate finance side and the inadequacy of participation of global south voices and also the women voices in particular, so the groups. So I'll move on with these three or four elements in my mind because you touched upon it and get our second speaker, Reina Otsuka, if I get the name correct, from UNDP. She's the digital innovation lead for nature, climate, and Chemicals and Waste Bureau for Policy and Program Support at the UNDP, serving as a technical lead for the emerging digital portfolio across, again, nature, climate, and environment practice. And prior to joining this, she was in Rwanda country office as environmental specialist. So I do believe there is a clubbing of two good roles that you share both from your regional experience, Reina, I think that's right. Sorry, Reina. And I
It's
would
Reina,
ask,
yes.
and I would actually try to sort of ladder upon this question of examples or instances where you see how UNDP is trying to, because I know there's an innovation cell, there are accelerator programs, is using the DPG or the DPI approach for climate action, if at all, and in what format, and which DPG are sort of from a global perspective and also from maybe a global south perspective are taking more traction at least in the policy mindset, in the discussion phase, things like this. So some examples that you can cite through would be great to know. Thank you. Over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. So in case people on this call don't know, UNDP, United Nations Development Program, is the development arm of the United Nations system. And so we have presence in 170 plus countries and territories, meaning we're trying to really look at things when it comes to digital from a global aspect to try to find emerging patterns. And it's really interesting because we're also a part of the Digital Public Goods Alliance, as well as we're doing a co-convening series with Rockefeller Foundation, co-develop, as well as GIZ and USAID, to try to find the intersection of DPIs and climate action. So it's really great to be here to discuss with a lot of technical experts here. So maybe a few examples, and it's interesting that Divya framed it as climate finance could be one other pillar that she didn't talk about. And I think I'll try to focus on that area. So at UNDP, I can talk about maybe 3 examples, one at the global level, and then one at the national level, and one at the local level. So at the global level, we are working on a transparency system, or a climate transparency system, and carbon registries for national governments to use. So we took a DPG approach because each government is starting to create very similar systems from scratch. So, and all of these systems usually follow the UNFCCC guideline, and it has to speak to each other at one point. So there is a need for interoperability. There is a need for following certain standards or guidelines. And we thought, since we're working with 130 countries and we're also working with World Bank, EBRD, UNFCCC, all of the main actors in this area, we all got together and started to design a national digital transparency system and carbon registry, including carbon registries, that any country can come in and replicate or just basically install and configure in the way that fits their own national context. So this is gaining a lot of traction, I guess, in your question, because a lot of countries are now doing this self-cooperation and learning mechanism right now. So we're really trying to push this together with the countries that are co-investing in one big code base, which everybody can continue to benefit from. So that's like an international global level DPG. And then when it goes to a national level, and again, it's all national, but sorry. There's a lot of pollen today outside, so I'm getting my throat. And the second one is, again, it's also about climate finance, but a different one. So carbon market is one big financial mechanism, but there's other innovative financing mechanisms that are starting. And one of it is called the payment for ecosystem service. And this is a results-based payment system where if a farmer or a local community and it creates a contract with the government or any kind of entity. And when they continue to conserve a forest or any kind of ecosystem like water systems, then they get paid for being a custodian of nature. And this is very important because it actually puts the power in the local communities and people that are most in need of these climate finance. And so, and at the end, they get cash payment or any, in some sort. And you probably already noticed that there are some DPI aspects that you can see in this. For this contract to actually work, you need some kind of digital ID. You would also need some kind of digital payment system, which can actually unlock a much bigger scale if we actually had a digital payment DPI in the country, which many countries still don't have. So this kind of going through this DPG thought process is actually also starting to bring us some insights into potential DPIs that could be scaled, or maybe there could be a 3rd or 4th DPI at the foundational level. And the last example is from India. The India country office worked with the Telangana state to create something called the DICRA, which is basically a data science-based platform where they use open data, or we use open data, and let academics or scientists to contribute their codes in everything in open space. And this is also an accredited DPG. which allows people to easily analyze climate resilient agriculture policies. And they're really trying to, the India country office is trying to get to the local level, at the farmland level, how policies play out at the farmland level. So that's another interesting one that also touches on AI, although it's still at the data science space right now. I'll stop here.
No, thanks a lot, Reina, for sticking to the time limits. Also, I mean, I'm not being very strict, but I really want to listen also and converge. I do take your points. I think the examples that you have pulled through, specifically in interoperability and the sort of innovation approach. I do also like that the whatever DPIs should be thought through as socio-technical systems should also have the foundation layer of impacting and benefiting people at the at the bottom of the pyramid, or you'll say last mile connectivity, how whomever is contributing to it internally, and that should also have a cascading effect. I think that's something which is still not being thought through. And yeah, Dikra, I know Shweta very well. I think it's a very good example of where open source and open data can be put to good test and good use, and then bring out some good climate resilient examples. So with this mind, I think I will try to move into a sphere of a little bit of a deep down with research, and I will take my next speaker, Ajay Shah, co-founder of XDRI. But let me read through his profile. He's from IIT Bombay, and then studied at UCLA, had positions at Center for Monitoring in Indian Economy, CMIE, and also Indira Gandhi Institute for Development Research, IGIDR, Department of Economic Affairs at Ministry of Finance, and National Institute for Public Finance and Policy. Thanks a lot, Ajay, for being here. I know as your co-founder of XKDR Forum, beg your pardon, I think your intersection of sort of economics, law, and public administration, how do you look at the previous two conversations, when we are being talking through, and what are the critiques or limitations that you think the DPI sort of model or these conversations lead into? Any existing sort of alternate approaches that has been discussed or have been found, which especially sort of maybe resonate in regional capacities, urban, semi-urban, rural, or something like this? And do you believe, where do you think that this all space is being, it will lead into next, say, 2 to 3 years? Over to you, Ajay. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Gauravh. With your permission, I'd like to say two things. So first, in response to what you just said, I think a lot about the new world of the IT revolution and the role that governments have played in this. For example, the early role of UNDP in bringing internet connectivity to many developing countries, including India. Okay, so there were remarkable things that have been done in this period. And I worry a little about carefully interrogating the words public good, okay, and public infrastructure. As a card-carrying economist, I would like to always remind everybody that the goodwill that we bestow upon the words public good are based on a narrow technical definition of a public good. Clean air in New Delhi is a public good, but a great deal of the practical operational technology and systems that we can use really don't fit the bill. And all too often, what we are seeing in this space is an expansion of a public sector, of government monopolies. And I feel that we should be careful about these things. The second thing I'd like to say is that I actually have one idea where there is a public good, where there is something to be done by way of a digital public good that fits in the field of climate change and climate mitigation. This is about the implementation of carbon taxes. Okay, so I'd like to just make the logic in 3 steps. So step 1, taxation of carbon emission is the most efficient way to decarbonize. It is the path to obtaining the required decarbonization of the world at the lowest possible cost. That taxation-based approaches will always be more efficient than regulatory approaches. However, the moment you start thinking about carbon taxation, even if you start thinking about regulation, but it is stark and clear around taxation, then there is the problem that there can be trade diversion. So one country imposes a high tax on carbon, another country imposes a low tax on carbon, or one country has a tough regulation on carbon emissions, another country has a lax regulation on carbon emission, and then that will generate a great deal of distortion by way of trade diversion. And therefore, the whole world is going to require border carbon taxes. Okay, and this is just something that we've got to think deeply about, that I see absolutely no way out. As I said, you could do regulatory approaches to reduce carbon emissions. I would always advocate taxation-based approaches because these are more efficient. But in either event, they are both trade distortionary. And the only way to rescue an efficient allocation of global production and all the glories of international trade and globalization is to have carbon border taxation. In that case, we're going to need tracking mechanisms for the grand total embedded carbon in every internationally traded commodity. So if you take this wristwatch made in India and sell it into Japan, we're going to need audited mechanisms of the grand total embedded carbon in this. So there is a watchmaking company that buys electricity. It buys a strap. The strap contains petrochemicals. There is embedded carbon in that, ... So we're going to need that comprehensive tracking of carbon that is embedded inside every internationally traded good and service. So there's a call center in India that is selling services to consumers in Finland. We're going to need the tracking mechanisms for the grand total comprehensive carbon emission embedded in the invoice that is raised. We're going to need systems, procedures, protocols to do that. And there, I think there is a need of a digital public good, which fits the true economics tests of what is a public good. This is a protocol and a set of software through which information will be captured on top of the value-added tax system that is there essentially in all major countries other than the United States. And that creates trusted, ideally cryptographically sound claims about embedded carbon and the taxation that has already been paid that are sent out with every export shipment and that are accepted at the recipient country. Without this kind of clean public goods approach, we will actually have chaos. We will have a world of multiple bilateral treaties, and that would just be terrible. We'll have hundreds of standards, and it'll be very confusing. So my opinion is that this is a place that requires a digital public good. And, I feel the usual international information interchange mechanisms for developing standards should be brought into this. The Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF, could potentially build a committee that will work on this. There is fair competence in India in the building of something that is called the GST network. So there are some very good ideas on the IT systems connected to the GST, but equally the VAT in Europe is a brilliant sound implementation. So I think the IETF is a good forum where some of this knowledge can come together, and the digital public good that is needed is that process that results in a standards document and a protocol and a reference document and a reference implementation, all of which are downloadable from a website, and software and documents that are downloadable from a website do indeed pass the definition of what is a public good. So I'll stop here. We can continue on this later.
Thanks, Ajay. I see the passion, and I also see the the clear-cut definition of how casually people use DPG, DPI, and I also believe that the monopolistic approach, especially in the tech world, when how policies are being now framed, specifically in AI, being driven by half a dozen companies influencing things in and around tech. But I also believe that the public good approach towards the narrow definitions and the government monopolies uh, is but you actually set things in like a, okay, taxation is easier to do rather than build the regulatory systems around it, because taxation, you have the experiences beforehand. And I do believe that there is it's a little bit of a hard task to actually embed the international trade mechanisms at each point and each sort of node to be made accountable. But I will leave it at
My
that. Yeah.
quick comment
Yeah.
is it's actually feasible to write this on top of a VAT or a GST system.
Sure.
And this is present in every important country in the world other than the United States. So the
Yeah.
United States has a problem. I feel everybody else in the world can actually build this because we are already doing all this for the VAT stroke GST. So there is a detailed, intrusive tracking mechanism everywhere in the modern international economy, except for the United States.
Yeah, I mean, my idea was not to have a cross question, but I take your point, valid points. Yeah. And so I'll move on because there are two more speakers left in our conversations to start with. And I will actually take it with Dr. Jeeno George, because I'm trying to couple the last two speakers from a technology geospatial point of view and also from a technology engineering point of view. So Dr. Jeeno George is a spatial planner and researcher, and she uses data to address climate-related challenges and improve spatial development through informed decision making for moving towards environmentally responsible, sustainable solutions. She works at the CivicDataLabs as a senior geospatial researcher and conceptualizes data-driven models that address complex challenges through well-informed strategies. A master's in doctoral research in urban studies from Department of Architecture and Regional Planning uh, and IIT Kharagpur. I leave it at that as an introduction. But Gino, I come to your question. Is like you are working at an interface of, say, you know, mm, at Civic Data Labs to make things open source, right? You want to also leverage the power of open source in harvesting sort of digital governance solutions. So, what are some of the challenges that you have faced when you are sort of thinking through the idea of DPGs? And do you believe in what form or part of climate action uh, they are accountable and feasible? And please, sort of, I hear some echo in the background. Please, others, keep your mics. So over to you, Gino. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, hi. Thanks. First of all, thank you, Digital Futures Lab, for having me here. Yes, Gauravh mentioned, I work at Civic Data Lab. We work at the intersection of data, tech, design, and social science. And our purpose is to bring more data out in the public so that it can empower both citizens and also decision makers for more informed decisions. And with respect to the challenges that we felt with using open source is, first of all, everybody assumes that open source is free, and when we go with and to solve this challenge, it is very important to first tell the community that open source just it is a place where it invites collaborations and innovators, and it makes data more accessible so that it enables informed decision, and the decision that the decision makers takes can also be transparent. That is, it can also be passed on to the citizens who can see why a decision is taken so that it improves their strength in the public institution. So when we started this where we have a project which is called Intelligent Data Solution for Disaster Risk Reduction in Assam, which specifically targets flood disaster reduction, because Assam is a flood prone state. And when we started it, we started first with going to the stakeholder, which is the Assam State Disaster Management Authority, to understand from them what is their requirement. And even there, the first thing is, why are you doing this? So we told them that we wanted to bring in a solution which would help them to take informed decisions, and which is also more engaging with this, with the different, which brings in all the different departments together through interoperability of data, and also which communicates their decisions to the community itself as a large. And then when we started, again, the question was, should we go for climate adaptation or for climate mitigation? And for many of them, it was just like, solve the problem right now, give us early warning system. And then when we talked actually to the stakeholder to understand what are their requirements, we understood that it is not just adaptation, and there are a lot of people working in that area, but they wanted something on resilience or mitigation. And they were asking us, how can you give us a solution where we can allocate our resources in an informed manner? And so we went forward with that, and we understood that for tackling disaster risk reduction, which itself is a multidimensional problem, we needed to take data sets from different sources, from flood hazard, from exposure, from vulnerability, and also coping capacity. And all these data sets are available in one form or the other, but it is in different places in siloed. And the entire challenge was to bring it all together in an interoperable manner so that we could build a model or an analytics over it. So I would say there are two challenges. One is first understanding the problem from the stakeholder itself. And the second is, how do you bring the different data sets together? And that is where DPI becomes very important, where the component of data exchange can be used to build a data registry where there is authorized access of data in a secure and a transparent manner. Back to you, Gauravh.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm just making note with my pencil, so beg your pardon if I'm a little bit delayed. I think you really sort of. I think you and Reina should also be talking more on the interoperability part of things and how they can be. But I do believe that yes, uh, context setting that open source is not free, but also the access of open source from a government perspective is. I know for every data you send, you might need to send an application, and I think the access problem of open source still is fundamentally rooted, I mean, from at least an Indian space. And I think also that we talked about the geospatial policy, and that still is a friction point, let's put it that way. And yes, the fragmentation of same data sets with different authorities in different formats creates also, I think, multiple challenges. Leading into that, my last and not least, the speaker, Aaditeshwar Seth, doctor, a professor, you can call him Adi, good friend, and from Department of Computer Science and Engineering at IIT Delhi, and co-founder of the social technology enterprise Gram Vani. He's passionate about building appropriate technologies, and I'm leading this into because the question is also on the chat. Why can't we talk about AI tools? And I think language is a very hot topic, in specifically in enabling with ChatGPT coming to life as a participatory tool. So I complete his introduction. He basically wants to empower the marginalized and oppressed communities to collective and voice themselves. And your question, Adi, is what potential do you see in these in this section? I think you can club this with DPIs in the language format. Could be an advisory in the processes for climate action, and where do you see some of the risks in adoption? Within an India specific space. And the proposition that how this will shape up, because we are currently in early stages of language technology getting out in the climate space. So over to you, Adi. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks, Gauravh, and thanks everyone for having me. I feel everything that I wanted to say has already been said, just in maybe slightly different words. So one of the things that we've been thinking about and talking about, especially when it comes to use of technology, is that is about participation. And hearing everyone, I think we're sort of all talking about different aspects of participation. So one aspect which Divya and Ajay touched upon, I think, is about who are we building these tools for? What is the purpose of these tools? Because that sort of starts defining the very essential building blocks on which different use cases can be constructed on these infrastructure components that are being built. So, for example, if systems are being built for individual users, then you get into having IDs for every user. And which was also the mindset with, let's say, things like Aadhaar. where the purpose that was envisioned originally was to prevent double benefits from reaching people. But if the purpose were different, right? If the purpose were sort of thought about from a community perspective, that how do we make sure that benefits reach those to whom it's not reaching, then it could have led to a very different kind of a DPI, right? Where we would actually be talking about community-based systems to improve awareness, to bring social accountability, and so on. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that if we think about who are the participants in sort of defining the purpose of what these DPIs or DPGs are meant for, that starts telling us that are we really being participatory in, let's say, consulting with communities on what kind of problems are they facing or what use cases do they want for which these tools should be built. Yeah. I think another aspect of participation then also is that when these tools are being used by people, can we ensure participatory management in also the use of these tools? And right, so over here, again, technology can be very interesting because technology can enforce certain processes. So if, let's say, the technology is being built to enforce processes that we want to be inclusive, we want to listen to marginalized castes, we want to get opinions from people from women, right? And that is sort of baked into the technology, right? So essentially, just like we think of terms like privacy by design, right? If in these DPIs, we're thinking from the standpoint of being accountable by design, being inclusive by design, then that again starts shaping that who are the participants who end up engaging on these platforms. Yeah. And I think the third part, which Jeeno and Reina have really been touching upon, is being participatory in terms of building the technology and managing and building on top of it, right? This is where open source and reuse, right? I mean, any software engineer will tell you that these are great things to have, right? Interoperability, because they ensure participation from a wide network of stakeholders and which enables innovation and more very rapid innovation. So I think that's another third aspect of participation. And in all of these, ultimately, what we're all talking about is being consultative, ensuring that there are processes in place or ensuring that the technology enforces certain processes in place so that there can be much wider participation, be it in defining the purpose, be it in defining how these platforms are managed, and similarly in how these platforms are built and created. Yeah. So just to keep it right, I mean, touch upon some of the parts that you mentioned on tools and use of large language models, right? So I think that's also where, as long as we're cognizant that are we applying large language models in for use cases that actually the community needs, or for whom are we designing it, right? I think that's the first part. Second, when it comes to being participatory, right? Are we getting feedback from people about, when are these things working? Are the whatever outputs LLMs, for example, are producing, are they reliable? Are they? Can you understand where they're coming from? Is there evidence in support of what the LLMs are outputting, right? So what's the feedback mechanism for that? That sort of starts becoming essential. And then, of course, when it comes to participation in terms of building new things on top of it, then again, right, how open are these? Right, so that's where we get into these debates about open LLMs versus non-open LLMs, and uh, transparency in terms of what data has gone into training the models and so on. So I think ultimately it's all about defining who are the stakeholders at all of these three different levels that we've brought into participating in defining the purpose, the management, and the way in which these things are being built.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Adi. I think there is a granularity understanding, when it comes to mapping the reality of challenges and trying to embed them as a DPI and how it can really benefit, something like, I would say the billion masses, right? So that type of notionality of how to build something. I think yes. In all these discussions, I do feel that sometimes the brass tacks of understanding the problem itself get missed out or gets flipped, right? And the decision makers are using maybe some keywords in putting this understanding together. So I mean, that's a great discussion. I think we touched upon fundamentally, foundationally, a lot of things. And to move on, I think there are a couple of questions which started from when the participants submitted the form. Uh, One of them is, and I think two or three of them basically also in the chat that I see is how can AI help generate prompts for regular sustainable climate action, right, at an individual level? And are there any tools similar to a smartwatch that can prompt and prompt, promote action? I also see a similar question with Sanju Suman in the chat is uh, if the speakers could talk about the AI tools that can help improve local level governance, for example, uh, I think he's giving examples for writing proposals and research on local solutions, but also translation and important climate concepts into local languages. So uh, please go ahead. For me, the questions are open. Anybody can raise the hand and start answering. Uh, and I would like to give Reina and Jeeno and Adi. I mean, people who have to also. I think there's a time constraint with some of them. So please come in. I just posted these two questions, which are still catching the attention on a generative AI level. So yeah, I'll silence myself. Any first responses or yeah, or should I crystal it better? Yeah, Adi, go ahead.
Gaurav, if you want to talk a little bit more about use of LLMs for at the community level for, let's say, improved local governance. So actually, I was very impressed actually. So we've been doing some work on trying to understand at a watershed and at a micro watershed level how a groundwater level is behaving. So we've been trying to construct time series data of how have well depths been changing in a particular area. And then we have data on how precipitation has been happening in this area, and similarly, other hydrological things like the runoff that's sort of going out. So I actually put this up to ChatGPT just today morning that how would you explain to a layperson that in this area, if the well depth in between 2015 to 2022, the well depths were recorded as average well depths recorded as 1 meter below ground level, then 1.5, and so on. And the precipitation, this is the precipitation, annual precipitation values. These are the runoff values. And then ChatGPT said, yeah, I'll be happy to explain this to a layoff. And it said that in this particular area, it seems that the water levels are stable. And even though the rainfall has been erratic, and this indicates a good watershed that's it's sustainable. And then I gave it another one in which the water levels were going down, and then it said that over here the area appears to be water stressed. So I mean, it was very interesting because this is one way in which you can actually create data literacy. Because if you go to the community and you're trying to, right, I mean, otherwise we try to do things like play water budgeting games with the community where we sit around in a circle and we try and chalk out, right, how the world is behaving, so that we can then get the community to start thinking and planning that what kind of watershed development they should do in their area. So this was very interesting, but then it also threw up a whole bunch of other questions, right? That how do we know that is this how reliable is this interpretation, right? For what kind of cases would it fail? Because there's no causal model that has been exposed. Similarly, I then started asking other things, right? That do you know what drought-resistant varieties are grown in Jamui in Bihar? And then it gave me a whole bunch of things, but again, I don't know if it's correct or not. So those are really, I think there's a lot of potential because with LLMs, it is sort of bridging the gap in terms of how the machine can make data easier to interpret for people, for example, and how they can communicate. But on the other hand, it's very nascent, and we're sort of at a very at the peak sort of the hype cycle, and use of these tools needs to be done in a conservative manner, right? And there's a long road to go. Of course, I mean, research is working on these things, but there's a long road to travel to bring out causality and such.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Adi.
Yes.
I think I will move the conversation back to Ajay and Dr. George, because it's a question by Chaitanya. Do you see a distinction between data as a public good and a protocol as a public good? And does that have inherent ownership or privacy issues? Uh, I mean, he has clubbed the question, and how can it be fairly utilized for public benefit? So, Ajay, maybe a comment from you, and then a comment from Dr. George.
Yes, when there are protocols that are developed in the community, which are not controlled by one firm, which are not controlled by a government, basically, the internet. When you have an IETF or an IEEE process through which a protocol evolves in a way that is not the property of a government or the property of one company, then yes, I do think that this has the characteristics of a public good. So it does check all the boxes. And in a way, that is one of the secrets of the magic of the internet, that what was so amazing about the internet and why it worked so well was precisely this, because something was done in the way of a public good, that while there was funding from the United States DARPA, okay, there is nothing wrong with government funding. There is something very wrong with government control. So as long as these things are done outside the control of government, then they can become public goods. On ownership of data, we've got to think carefully about it. When there is taxpayer-funded data that is released in the public domain by a government, then it does have the characteristics of a public good. The most beautiful example is the United States Tiger database, which is comprehensive maps data and demographic data that is released by the US government. And for example, in the early days, was used by Google to build Google Maps, or by anybody else to do whatever they want. And for a contrast, in India, neither Census nor Survey of India is doing meaningful data release. So we've got it exactly upside down, that they're taking taxpayer money and they're not giving us that public good. So yes, data that is taxpayer funded and released in an open and permissionless manner. Okay, so you shouldn't have to go get a name password to get the data. When you have to pay user charges to some government agency to get the data, it just doesn't make any sense. Look, you've already taxed me to pay for that government agency. Now, a government agency is not a business. They should not be charging money for that data. But yes, that kind of data does indeed have the characteristics of a public good. That said, it's important to recognize that there is an enormous and healthy and important private sector business of constructing and selling databases. And we should respect the presence of that private market for data as well. So private people do many kinds of information gathering, and they sell it as a private good. And sometimes I have seen people proposing that we should use the coercive power of the state to expropriate private persons and nationalize that data and make it government property. And that just doesn't seem right to me. Once you start expropriating people, it takes away all incentive for private people to build anything. Okay, like we've seen that movie before. It's called Socialism. It doesn't work.
No, thanks a lot, Ajay. Dr. Jeeno, your point, and then I'll actually move to Reina because she has to leave, and I really got a hint for that. But Jeeno, please put your comments, and then yeah, we can move on the similar question, on the same question. Sorry.
So I agree with what Ajay told. Whenever the data is publicly funded, it has to be democratic. Like anybody should be able to have access to the data as long as the PII, that is the private identifiable information, is not there. But whenever government does it, when there is a data exchange platform, there should be two sides of it. One where there is private data, which is Aadhaar or identifiable data, which could be useful for welfare payments, which is not accessible to the general public or for any kind of analytics. And only the aggregated data should come out in the open public so that it can become a public good. Yeah, that is from me.
Sure. Reina, I have a question regarding this national digital registry systems. I mean, I'm thinking like, aloud. You have these disparate systems of where people are collecting. Ajay gave an example of how India is collecting and US collecting. I mean, the simple collection of data is not standardized to begin with, right? And it's a major problem because I'm not talking about even climate as a sector, but any sector that you take, just to begin that standardization process of data collection to really make data analytics or make things on top of it work is a huge task. How feasibly sort of mindful are people of this basic problem, right? And where are you trying to solve this through a global interface with World Bank and other developmental agencies in your particular profile? Yeah, thank you.
No, no, great question. And actually, India, I believe the government is in the process of starting the transparency system. So again, this is not something that technology itself can solve, right? It is a bigger issue of capacity building. It is an issue of data sharing, policies, data standards, as you say. So generally, when we approach these transparency, we don't go and say we're going to build an IT system. We talk about it as capacity building. The data comes first, and then the system follows. So there is an international level, effort, from a lot of different funding sources, like the JAF or or a lot of bilateral funding is also go into this kind of capacity building. So I would say it just needs to be approached as a whole of society, whole of government issue. And I guess the digital technology, again, it's an enabler, which then once the standards are set, if there's a data sharing policy that follows, other people can also start to contribute this data, right? So it's also interesting how Ajay was saying, private sector companies we can't take the data from them, but there could be ways that this becomes a digital public infrastructure where private sector companies also have an incentive to share a part of their data, which doesn't have any competitive, reasoning to keep. So I think we're trying to really, that's why we don't want to just approach it just as a DPG system. We want to see what are those major protocols or data standards that we need to also build, not only at the national level, but also to be, again, interoperable with other systems. And it's interesting, with World Bank, we had so many conversations, and just connecting between the CAT Trust, which already exists, and other national registries and some of these, DPG-based national registries, it has been a long process. And so it's an iterative process, but we just need to continue and try to find all the, whatever that can be standardized or shared across different countries or even within the country.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult answer, but
it's actually, but it's always this conversation because it is a global north and a global south topic of a conversation as well. Because, if you are doing something systematically with a standardized way and you are enabling technology on top of it, it is making your work faster and quicker, and the same way of doing it. It's, the blatant example is how do you shift from Excel to sensor-based data systems, right? Which are more accurate and, which are not like data manual entries. So I take your point. I would actually move to Divya because I think I had left her in between when she was trying to bring in the urban examples. And please elaborate, Divya. I think your examples on how you interface with this, maybe through on the emerging side of DPGs that you are seeing. And you had mentioned energy and urban as one of the cluster idea. I did not catch it completely, but please go ahead and sort of solution that argument. Yeah.
And not a problem. I'll just make a quick reflection of what I was saying. Actually, when we talk about climate action, because we are working on that side, we look at tools and policies that facilitate that implementation, that facilitate scaling up, that facilitate speeding up the climate action. That is our work. We might not understand which technology and how, but we do understand what do we need to scale it up. And so that's where I was coming from. When we talk about climate impacts, there's a lot and there's area of body of work that needs to be done, and it's already been done. We heard a lot from our experts here around extreme events, which looks like an easy thing to understand. But there is a whole lot of things that can be done and need to be done around slow onset climate impacts. So what I'm speaking about, for example, is within the buildings area or the built environment system, there's a lot that we can do to bring in efficiency of built environment. There's a lot we could do to look at to measure UHI, for example, urban heat island, and come up with strategies that can help us maneuver past some of these problems of the modern world, because we are used to using a lot of mechanical tools for heating and cooling in our side of world and heating in other side of the world. So I was just going to make that remark that these are whole lot of areas where we could have interventions which we still lack, and but there is a huge lot of opportunity, uh, which will also come with demand for capacity building and finance to make it work. And it will, open up the another Pandora box of how revenue generation in urban area and things like that. But I think I'll keep it there and see if you have anything to add to that.
No, thank you, Divya. I certainly do believe that there are some cross-industry examples, uh, which also even technology enablement. We have seen how the use of AI as a system can really make power lines more efficient. The power loss is more accountable. Things very simple. Uh, but again, when you think on a DPI level, can energy sector do something on that scale of making a DPI is always a bigger question. How good are we on time? I think we are having practically
We
20
have
minutes.
about 20 minutes more. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So I would still then, I just want to set the tone on the AI part a little bit more, because I do believe there is, the fascination of Chat GPT. But, just to also for the contextualization of climate, till the time the Chat GPT is not in your dialect, in a local language at a level which you can really understand and see through, the data is still missing a lot on that scale. I think that's fundamentally also Adi wanted to put through. But just to give a notion that AI is not a utopian solution that, okay, please use AI, it will solve this. So just be mindful on that. I have a question, and then I will try to wrap it up. Any thoughts on possible? Sajid is asking on possible conflict in adoption of technology, digital or otherwise, for climate adaptation at the local level versus climate change mitigation policy at the national global level. Good point. Anybody wants to raise your hand and answer? Ajay, Adi, Divya. I hope the question was clear. Any thoughts on possible conflict in adoption of technology for climate adaptation action at the local level versus climate change mitigation policy at the national level? Or maybe too complicated? Yeah, Adi, go ahead.
Um, I mean, on this particular thing, I mean, I think if we want to look at a conflict between some national or global priorities and how it conflicts at the local level, I mean, one example is carbon itself, right? Carbon credits. So, a lot of the way in which, I mean, because there is a decarbonization, carbon sequestration agenda, and there are carbon credits and everything for that. What we're seeing, however, is that one way in which it is being pursued very intensively is through aggregators or project developers. So what they basically do is that they pool a lot of farmers together, right, in the tens of thousands, that scale. And these are largely smallholder farmers. And the promise is that if farmers change their farming practices, like going for no-till agriculture or planting trees and so on, or moving from cropping to tree planting in some part of their land, then they will get a monetary benefit. But what is sort of hidden often and goes unsaid is how much actually the farmer stands to make, or an individual farmer stands to make. So if you do the calculations based on current carbon prices and stuff, so the aggregator will definitely benefit a lot, because they are talking of the scale of tens of thousands of hectares. But the individual farmer just gets like a couple of hundred rupees. So these are some examples where potentially it is poor awareness, or it is riding on disinformation, um, where or private incentives, right, where things go out of line. And again, this sort of goes back to what I think all of us have been talking about, that something that Divya also mentioned, right, that like in urban areas, the point about temperature and heat and so on as being very important, but not getting enough attention possibly. So I think that's the whole argument, that need to have wide consultations to come up with, right, what are the main things that will actually be public good, right, be good for the public, like Ajay was also saying, and then build towards that. In the absence of this clear purpose definition, right, then misuse and all of these things tend to happen.
Yeah, I take your point, Adi, on the. I think the misinformation part is very pertinent. Actually, Divya needs to leave, and I think I really want to grasp this group. I think Reina had to leave earlier, but and I will come back to one more question which has been left out. Is like any recommendation from each of you, for what could be a good DPI for climate action, or should or could be, in that line. So I leave it to Divya to begin with, and then take this conversation further, and then you can leave. Divya, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Gauravh, for taking my request. Very quickly, I think from my perspective, because I come from the policy side of things, I think policy ecosystem around any deployment of DPI, whether it is digital public goods or digital public infrastructure, would be very important to make sure. One, because of the need for um, how the data can be used or misused, but also for scaling up, speeding up action on the ground, given the criticality of the climate impacts and the time that we have to mitigate carbon dioxide emission, the Paris Agreement. And the other thing is around um, enabling capacity and enabling environment for the deployment itself. And of course, your point around accountability, which is even more important. So I think four things from my side. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Divya. Ajay, please, couple of minutes.
I already gave you my practical idea. It's a fully articulated vision, and I think the world needs it. I think it can be done. I think that there is an institutional framework. The thing is, we've got to connect up the blokes in IETF or IEEE who don't think of climate, who don't think of public finance. That we need their governance frameworks. We need their concepts of work done in the community that is not controlled by a government, that is not controlled by a company. We need their constitution. We need their values. And then a bunch of people in the world of public finance. By the way, there are some analogies around customs data interchange. It's called EDA. But unfortunately, it was just done in an easy time. It was done by European governments with each other. In today's world, that model would not work.
No, I do believe, but I am of an idea that sometimes the low and middle income countries would say, "Oh, taxation and our carbon footprint will increase, so we have to start paying more." Right? I mean, I am of the idea for sure, in a sense of some carbon taxation policies which is agile, and the word encapsulates everything, maybe or nothing, is tantamount. But it takes, it will take courage. To actually walk that path with
So
any.
strategically, I want to say that
Mm.
if the world does not solve the problem of how to protect international trade from carbon taxes, then the global welfare cost of carbon taxation and carbon regulation will go up dramatically. So carbon border taxes are fundamental. Now we've got to learn how to implement them. And then you can debate regulatory pathways, taxation pathways, whatever. And the whole climate justice story turns into government to government payments that are a side story compared to the main business of a private economy trading with each other.
Yes. No, I mean, in cognizance of your thoughts, I have been put through some reposting of some questions. Maybe I have missed them out in the chat. Is the primary challenges implementing around DPIs for climate resilience? What are some of the key steps to overcome and address them? Are there any DPIs for climate resilience which can be in modeling? What are some of the, and how can we maintain data transparency and equitable access? I think Jeeno and Adi, you are right, but I really would like to put these two questions before I miss them. Yeah.
I have one line in that.
Sure,
I
Ajay.
think the greatest public good in the field of climate adaptation is satellite imagery data. And one big weakness in that field is called ISRO. That ISRO just releases too little and makes your life difficult when you want to use ISRO data. Every researcher that I know in India works with the Japanese data and the European data and the American data, and like ISRO has amazing stuff, but they hoard it and they don't release.
Yes, yes. No, I think there are questions which are still in the limelight, but I know Landsat and Sentinels, but I think this is drifting too much in the satellite space imagery. But Adi, on the question of coupling together with some challenges on climate adaptation and also on the data side of it.
I'm sorry, Gauravh, could you repeat the question? I actually started reading these principles of DPGs that Srinand posted. Could you just repeat the question?
Yeah. The question was, I think, on let me just scroll down. Yes. Primary challenges in implementing models around DPI for climate resilience, some of the key steps. Specifically, they want to know that how we maintain data transparency and equitable access to the data for marginalized groups, because you deal with them. Yeah.
So yeah, I think one is exactly, touching upon what Jeeno and Ajay were saying, that just the availability of data, and with clear metadata details about it, right? What's the resolution and so on. That I think is very, very important. And it's also, I mean, like, for example, if we talk about administrative boundaries in India, that data is just not available. We are using some 2001 village boundaries, which are actually published by NASA. Um, but we're not able to get this from anywhere in India, for example. Another example, right, ISRO, I think that's a great example, that they have very high resolution data, but to get access to the data, you have to write a letter to them, and then, well, I wrote twice, but I never got a reply. So, right, so those are where, I mean, that's one bottleneck in bringing or trying to use this geospatial data to build things. The other, I think, when you talk about vulnerability over there, there's hardly any data. I mean, the only vulnerability data we have is from census 2011, which is at the village level. In terms of caste groups and income levels and so on. So one, the census again has been delayed. So that's again one big thing missing in terms of the potential to use technology, right? And do something specifically to identify, I mean, like just simple things like identify what are the most vulnerable pockets as of today, and then target interventions for some of these areas. Right. That's so yeah. So I think there's a lot that can be done, and these are some data availability is definitely one thing that comes in the way. Then other things like who uses these things, right? So you need ultimately, if you want the communities to be able to have a say in deciding what should be built, what use cases to be solved, can they have mechanisms to provide feedback? Can they have a say in the management of these technologies? Then you need capacity building, you need connectivity. So a lot of these things need to go together, because otherwise, just like so many other technologies, right, it often ends up amplifying inequalities, because the people for whom you're trying to build, they're not able to use it effectively. So yeah, so I think that's one of the big things to solve.
No, thanks. I think we are still. I know people are now jumping in or jumping out, but Hari Krishnan is asking about initiating a project or organization centered around climate and data. I'm curious about how smaller entities like startups or organizations can exert influence on policies and facilitate large-scale impact pertaining to digital public goods. Especially because the discussion here, it seems to be largely like big players like government, ITF, and tech giants. So, yeah, any take on it? Yeah, Jeeno, you want to
Yeah.
put some context here?
Yes, so I come from a startup, a tech startup, and so we have built this model for asset cover for disaster risk reduction, and we have even though our model is still to be adopted by the government, we have verified it and seen that our based on the results of our model, almost 10 out of the almost 95% of the districts, the allocation has been as per the recommendation that we gave using our model. And now in our model, we use data from ISRO. We use Bhuvan's flood inundation maps because there is no other data which is as accurate, because one, it is from our government, also it's also field verified. So it was not easily available. It was difficult. There was a technical challenge that was involved in accessing the data. And because we have a data team and a tech team with us, maybe we were able to scrape the data from the public website. And then with respect to vulnerability, and there was also a question with how do we ensure that all these data sets are are not fudged. So how we do that is we don't take data just from one single source. We make sure that the data sources are different. Like when it comes to demographic exposure and vulnerability, we just don't rely only on census data. Like as we said, census data is outdated, but there is another source called World Pop, and there are several other satellite imagery derived data sources for population, which give population estimates, which take census as their base to project the data. And there is another data source which we recently came across, which is Mission Andodhya, which provides population level data at village level. And in the case of India, we would be surprised, but we have progressed a lot. They also have this unique place codes, which can be linked to Bharat Maps. Now, Bharat Map is a source where we have all these administrative boundaries. I am not sure how updated it is, but it is always a starting point to get the work done and then bring it back to the government stakeholders to show them what are the different use cases that is possible with all the data sets that you have in different places. How about bringing it all together using a data exchange platform so that it is more accessible to the people, and also making sure that certain standards are followed in this data. Yeah, in case of vulnerability for Assam, they also have this data on daily flood damage report. Now, this data is collected from the field, aggregated on a tabular format, but then brought it in a PDF format and put it online. And then we had a difficulty in bringing it back to tabular format so that it can be integrated with our other data sources. But still, that is again a step. I don't know whether there is any other state governments in India who has a damage data, which is very crucial to understand how are the damages that is actually happened, what is the other socioeconomic characteristics, and how does it relate to the actual spending the government does on ground. So I come from not a tech background, but I work with a startup, and we have been the governments are now open. Many of them are receptive to new ideas. They call us and we also go and show their ideas. And of course, it is not easy. They don't accept it in one go. We have to do it again and again. But it is I am a little more on the positive side, maybe because but I do find.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think I hear a lot of hustling and resilience in your voice, which is a good thing for any startup to actually gain traction on. And I think Ajay, you would maybe have a good conversation with Jeeno on how they could manage Bhuvan and things like that, from the government on a smaller, on a faster scale. But it showcases that yes, there even the governments are actually doing some work, maybe in a static way, or the collection might not be verifiably accurate, right? But at least you can benchmark something on a bedrock and say, we have these 5 data sets to begin with. Let's at least put this together and showcase something which is of utility for planning, for the government. Okay. Okay. I still have the last question for you, for Jeeno, and also for Adi. What recommendation you should have for the DPI for climate action? Just one recommendation that you would see is feasible. So I would start with you, Adi, and then push over to Jeeno.
I can talk about something that we are doing, which is basically trying to build, again, tools for the community, which the community can use to put forth demands and proposals for natural resource management works that are relevant for them. So things like construction of farm ponds, check dams, tree plantations. So this is where we're using a lot of geospatial data through which one we help we try to diagnose what's the key issue in a particular area, so that and to what extent can it be changed so that that particular ecosystem becomes viable and sustainable. So here one important point that we're using is that we have this concept of an ecosystem, and we're working at the scale of micro watersheds. um, right, so that's sort of right, we were talking about registries and so on, right? So that kind of becomes a key unit of analysis for us, on which we try and understand what's wrong, and then through the tool, the idea is the community can propose what they want and put these up in the Gram Sabha, through which it can be channeled for funding through Narega and other government schemes. We also want to have a strong element of transparency over here, so that any plans being proposed for an area, they are transparently available to anyone. So it's right, it's by design that is transparent and accountable, and people can contest, people can give their own suggestions, they can comment on what has been proposed. So hopefully that is also one way to bring attention to voices which otherwise might go unheard.
Yeah, no, thank you. I give the last words to Jeeno, and Ajay, thank you for sharing the blog. I think people can go through it and other resources. So Jeeno, what is your suggestion?
My suggestion is a data exchange and registry, like Adi mentioned, because that is because in with case of DPIs, we have digital payments, we have digital identity. Now, what is lacking? Like I think Telangana government already has an agricultural data exchange platform, and this needs to be expanded across the sectors, because that is the only thing which would enable other innovators to build upon it. Because see, government cannot do anything, they are stewards of this data. Now they bring the data out and they enable other academicians, researchers, maybe even startups to work on it and bring the insights and take it back. And that is where, like, once we have a model, or like it's not one model, it's a continuous process. It needs to be spearheaded by policymakers, experts, and the program managers, while there is a tech backend at it who would be working on the mathematics part. But it is not it is not static. It is something which continuously grows, and this is possible only when we have a good data exchange registry. So I think there are already things in place, like we have Digit Core, which works in the similar direction. So my recommendation would be on that.
No, I mean, I should not start a sentence with no, but I do believe that's, yeah. Uh, we can wrap up now, but I sense that, when we also talk around the development part of data, there are multiple voices, and of course there is a sentiment that if data is the king, if we collect, then if we put it in the open, then others will benefit. It is very, I think, rudimentary way of putting this, but. Uh, Thank you for your time. And I do believe that the DPI on climate action is a priority for the government of India. I mean, in a sense of climate action as such, the mitigation has always been the big sentiment. I also heard that I think Divya was talking about it, the acute climate changes, and these have become frequent. And so we have understood that the climate is getting bad, and there would be more mitigation and some efforts on arresting this change. Is better to have I would say more mitigation efforts being put to test and adaptation measures being put to test. And in that sense, the DPI, hopefully, at least in the data frame of it, data exchange frame of it, which I also feel, because it is agnostic to the sector and it is actually influencing all sectors, would be a key shift. Thank you for being articulate with your thoughts, and for providing your deep insights. Wish you well.